The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet suburban streets. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the sidewalk. It was the kind of evening where everything seemed peaceful, until the sound of a police siren pierced through the calm. Elijah Johnson, a 14-year-old with a basketball tucked under one arm and a backpack slung over his shoulder, pedaled furiously on his bike. His heart raced as he glanced back at the patrol car trailing him, its flashing lights reflecting off the nearby houses. He hadn't been doing anything wrong really, just riding home after practice, but he knew he'd made one mistake. His bike didn't have any lights. Slowing down reluctantly, Elijah pulled over to the curb. He steadied himself, gripping the handlebars tightly as the officer stepped out of the car. Officer Mark Reynolds approached with a clipboard in hand, his expression stern but not unkind. "Evening, young man," he said, his voice firm. "You know it's against the law to ride without lights after dark?" Elijah nodded quickly, his wide eyes betraying his nervousness. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice soft but respectful. "I'm sorry. I was just heading home from basketball practice." Officer Reynolds tilted his head slightly, studying the boy. Something about Elijah's polite tone caught his attention, but he remained cautious. "Basketball practice, huh? That's good. But where are your parents? Do they know you're out this late?" Elijah hesitated for only a moment before answering confidently, "Yes, sir. My dad knows I'm out. He'll probably be here soon." "Oh, really?" Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the boy's certainty. "And what does your dad do?" Elijah straightened up, puffing out his chest a little. "He's in Special Forces," he said proudly, his voice steady despite the situation. "He works hard to keep people safe." For a split second, there was silence. Then Officer Reynolds let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Special Forces, huh?" he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "That's quite the story. You sure he's not just, I don't know, working late or something?" Elijah's cheeks flushed red, embarrassment creeping into his features. Still, he didn't back down. "No, sir. I'm telling the truth. My dad's a hero. You'll see when he gets here." Officer Reynolds smirked faintly, jotting something down on his clipboard. "All right, kid, we'll see about that." But deep down, he couldn't help feeling amused. The idea of a teenager claiming his dad was some elite soldier felt like something out of a movie. Surely the boy was exaggerating, or maybe just trying to impress him. Unbeknownst to both of them, however, fate had other plans. Just as Officer Reynolds prepared to give Elijah a warning and send him on his way, the distant rumble of an engine grew louder. Both turned their heads toward the sound, watching as a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the scene. The driver's door opened and a figure stepped out, a man whose presence immediately commanded attention. Little did Officer Reynolds know, this chance encounter was about to change his perspective, and perhaps even his life, forever. The man who stepped out of the SUV moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the air around him. He wasn't particularly tall, but there was something about the way he carried himself, shoulders back, steps measured, eyes scanning the scene, that made it impossible to ignore him. Elijah's face lit up instantly, and he waved enthusiastically. "Dad," he called out, his earlier embarrassment melting away. Officer Reynolds froze for a moment, his pen hovering mid-air over the clipboard. The man walking toward them didn't look like someone who had just stumbled onto the scene. His leather jacket and jeans were simple enough, but his posture radiated authority. As he approached, Officer Reynolds noticed the faint outline of a badge clipped to his belt, a detail that sent a jolt of unease through him. "Elijah," the man said in a deep, steady voice as he reached them. His tone was calm yet firm, the kind that demanded respect without needing to raise its volume. Then, turning to Officer Reynolds, he extended a hand. "Good evening, officer. I'm Marcus Johnson, Elijah's father." Officer Reynolds hesitated, before shaking the man's hand, his mind racing. Something about Marcus felt different. There was no arrogance or hostility in his demeanor, only a quiet strength that made the officer feel oddly self-conscious. Forcing a polite smile, he replied, "Evening, Mr. Johnson. Your son was riding his bike without lights after sunset, just trying to make sure everyone stays safe. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, glancing at Elijah with a brief flicker of disapproval. I see. Well, thank you for looking out for him. Turning back to the officer, he added, but I can assure you we take safety very seriously in our household. Elijah, standing slightly behind his dad now, couldn't help but grin. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for, the moment when his father would prove Officer Reynolds wrong. But Marcus wasn't done yet. With a casual ease, he continued, You mentioned something earlier about special forces? Officer Reynolds blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure how to proceed. Was this really happening? Could this man actually be who Elijah claimed? I did mention that, yes, Elijah chimed in, his voice brimming with pride. And I wasn't lying. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder before addressing the officer once more. My apologies if my boy caused any confusion, he said smoothly, but he's right. I do serve in the U.S. Army Special Forces, Green Berets to be specific. The words hung in the air like a challenge, each syllable carrying weight. Officer Reynolds stared at Marcus, searching for any sign of exaggeration or falsehood. But all he saw was sincerity, and something else. That same commanding presence he'd noticed earlier now seemed even more pronounced, almost intimidating. To break the awkward silence, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wallet-like case. Flipping it open, he revealed an identification card along with several insignias pinned neatly inside. One of them bore the unmistakably familiar emblem of the Green Berets. Officer Reynolds recognized it immediately. He'd seen it during training sessions and community events where veterans spoke about their service. For the first time since pulling Elijah over, Officer Reynolds felt a pang of uncertainty. Had he misjudged the situation entirely? Worse still, had he allowed his skepticism to blind him to the truth? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Elijah crossed his arms smugly, clearly enjoying the turn of events. Told you so, he muttered, under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus shot his son a quick glance, silently reminding him to stay humble. Then, addressing the officer again, he said, Look, Officer Reynolds, I understand your job isn't easy. Keeping communities safe is important work, but sometimes people underestimate others based on appearances or assumptions. His words struck a nerve. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how dismissive he'd been earlier. What started as a routine traffic stop was quickly becoming a lesson in humility, and one he wouldn't soon forget. Officer Reynolds stood there gripping his clipboard a little too tightly as Marcus Johnson's words sank in. The man hadn't raised his voice or shown any sign of anger, but his calm demeanor carried an undeniable authority that left the officer feeling exposed. It was as if every skeptical thought he'd had earlier about Elijah's claim was being laid bare and judged. Marcus tucked the ID case back into his pocket and turned to Elijah, giving him a reassuring smile. You okay, son? He asked softly, his tone warm and protective. Elijah nodded eagerly, his earlier embarrassment replaced by pride. Yeah, Dad. I told him you were coming. Marcus chuckled lightly, ruffling his son's hair. Well, I'm glad I didn't keep you waiting too long. Then, turning back to Officer Reynolds, he added, I appreciate your concern for my boy's safety, but let me ask, what made you think he was lying? The question caught Officer Reynolds off guard. He hesitated, unsure how to respond without sounding defensive. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, It's not that I thought he was lying, exactly. It's just... His voice trailed off as he realized how flimsy his reasoning sounded now. How could he explain that he'd dismissed Elijah's words because they seemed too extraordinary, too unlikely? Marcus didn't press further. Instead, he folded his arms casually and leaned slightly forward, his piercing gaze locking onto the officer's. Let me share something with you, he began, his voice steady and deliberate. In my line of work, we deal with people from all walks of life. Soldiers, civilians, leaders, families, you name it. And one thing I've learned is this: never underestimate someone based on what you assume about them. Officer Reynolds felt his cheeks grow warm. The lecture wasn't harsh or condescending. It was measured, thoughtful, almost like a lesson shared between equals. Yet it stung, because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. He had underestimated Elijah. Worse still, he'd done so without even realizing it. Elijah watched the exchange silently, his expression a mix of triumph and curiosity. This wasn't the first time his dad had taught him, or others, a valuable lesson, but seeing it happen, in real time, especially to someone who had doubted him, filled him with a quiet satisfaction. As the tension lingered in the air, Marcus broke the silence with a small gesture. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Officer Reynolds. If you ever want to learn more about what we do in Special Forces, or maybe even talk about building trust within the community, I'd be happy to help. The offer took Officer Reynolds by surprise. Here was a man who, by all rights, could have been angry or confrontational after being laughed at. But instead, Marcus was extending an olive branch, offering guidance rather than judgment. It was humbling and eye-opening. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Officer Reynolds managed to say, his voice tinged with genuine respect. I'll take that under advisement." Marcus gave a slight nod, then turned his attention back to Elijah. "All right, champ, let's get you home. Your mom's probably wondering where we are." Elijah grinned, hopping onto his bike. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice brimming with gratitude, not just for the rescue, but for the way his father had handled everything. As Marcus climbed back into his SUV and started the engine, Officer Reynolds remained standing beside his patrol car, watching them drive away. The flashing lights of his vehicle cast long shadows across the street, but they couldn't distract him from the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He replayed the conversation in his mind, each word echoing louder than before. Never underestimate someone. Build trust. Learn more. These phrases repeated themselves like a mantra, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth. He'd let his assumptions cloud his judgment, and while the encounter might have ended peacefully, it left him with a challenge, one that would stay with him long after the night faded into memory. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy or awkward. Elijah sat in the passenger seat of the SUV, glancing over at his dad every now and then, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but there was a faint trace of a grin on his face too. Both father and son knew what had just happened back there, though neither of them said it outright. "You didn't have to come all the way out here, Dad," Elijah finally said, breaking the silence. "I mean, I could have handled it." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Handled it? Sure you could have, but where's the fun in that?" He glanced at his son briefly before focusing back on the road. "Besides, no one gets to laugh at my boy and walk away thinking they're right." Elijah laughed, leaning back in his seat. "Yeah, well, I think Officer Reynolds learned his lesson pretty quick." "He did," Marcus agreed, his tone thoughtful. "But let's not forget something important, Elijah. People make mistakes. Sometimes they say things without meaning harm, but that doesn't excuse bad behavior. What matters is how we respond when those moments happen." Elijah frowned slightly, tilting his head. "What do you mean?" Marcus slowed down for a red light and turned to look at his son. "That officer made an assumption about you tonight. Maybe he didn't even realize he was doing it. But instead of getting upset or lashing out, you stayed calm and told the truth. That takes courage, son, and it shows character." Elijah stared at his dad, processing the words. Courage? Character? He hadn't thought about it like that. To him, he'd just been defending himself and telling the truth. But hearing his dad frame it this way made him feel different, stronger somehow. "And me?" Marcus continued, nodding toward himself. "I didn't go there to embarrass him or prove a point. I went there because you're my kid, and I wanted to show him, and that respect goes both ways. If someone doubts you, don't get mad. Show them who you are through your actions, not your anger. By the time they pulled into their driveway, Elijah felt like he'd been given more than just a ride home. His dad had handed him a lesson, wrapped in wisdom, one that would stick with him for years to come. Meanwhile, miles away, Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car parked near the curb of an empty street. The night was still young, but his mind was far from work. All he could think about was Marcus Johnson, the man who had walked onto the scene so confidently, dismantling assumptions with nothing more than calm words and undeniable proof. Reynolds replayed the conversation again and again, each detail sharper than the last. The ID card, the insignia. The way Marcus carried himself, not with arrogance but with quiet authority. It wasn't just the fact that Elijah's dad really was in special forces. It was the way he handled the situation that stuck with the officer. There had been no gloating, no lectures meant to shame, just honesty and grace. I messed up, Reynolds muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For once, he wasn't worried about protocol or rules. He was thinking about people, about trust, about how easy it was to let biases creep in unnoticed until they shaped your decisions. His radio crackled to life, pulling him out of his thoughts. Dispatch was calling for backup nearby. Normally he'd jump at the chance to help, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. He picked up the mic and responded mechanically, his voice distant. As he drove off, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus, standing there, offering a business card instead of judgment. For the first time in a long while, Officer Reynolds felt something unfamiliar, a mix of guilt and determination. Guilt for letting skepticism cloud his perspective, and determination to do better. Because if a man like Marcus Johnson could take a moment of misunderstanding and turn it into a teaching opportunity, maybe Reynolds could too. And as the patrol car disappeared around the corner, the seed of change began to grow, not just in one officer's heart, but in the community waiting to see what would come next. The days following the incident passed quickly for Elijah, but the memory of that night lingered like a warm glow in his mind. At school, he couldn't help but share bits of the story with his friends during lunch. "You should have seen Officer Reynolds' face when my dad showed up," he said, grinning as he mimicked the officer's stunned expression. His friends laughed and teased him good-naturedly, calling him Special Forces Junior. But beneath the jokes, Elijah felt a newfound sense of pride, not just in his dad but in himself for standing his ground. At home, however, things were quieter. Marcus didn't bring up the encounter unless Elijah did, and even then he kept his responses light. "It's not about proving people wrong, champ," he reminded Elijah one evening while they worked on assembling a bookshelf together. "It's about showing them who you are without needing to shout it." Elijah nodded, hammering a nail into place. "I know, Dad, but still, I think Officer Reynolds really got the message," Marcus chuckled, handing him another piece of wood. Well, if he didn't before, he probably does now. What Elijah didn't realize was that Officer Reynolds had been thinking about it a lot. In fact, the encounter had stuck with him so deeply that it began to influence how he approached his job. The next morning, during roll call at the precinct, Reynolds found himself tuning out the usual updates on traffic patterns and neighborhood complaints. Instead, his mind wandered back to Marcus's parting words. "If you ever want to learn more." After the meeting ended, Reynolds hesitated outside the briefing room, staring at the business card Marcus had given him. It was simple, just a name, a phone number, and the insignia of the Green Berets embossed neatly in the corner. He'd tucked it into his wallet after the incident, unsure if he'd ever use it. But now, standing there among his fellow officers, he felt an unexpected urge to reach out. That evening, after his shift ended, Reynolds dialed the number. To his surprise, Marcus answered on the second ring. "Hello?" came the familiar voice, steady and calm. "Mr. Johnson, this is Officer Mark Reynolds," he began, suddenly feeling nervous. "We met the other night. With your son. There, Was a brief pause, and then Marcus replied warmly, "Of course, Officer Reynolds, how can I help you?" Reynolds took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to thank you again for handling everything so professionally. And, well, I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk sometime. Maybe share some insights about building trust within communities? I think we could all benefit from hearing your perspective." To his relief, Marcus agreed immediately. "I'd be happy to," he said. "Trust me, it's something I care about too. Why don't we set something up soon?" Over the next few weeks, Reynolds and Marcus met several times. At first over coffee, then later at community events where Marcus spoke about his experiences in the military and working with diverse teams around the world. Their conversations weren't always easy. Reynolds often found himself confronting uncomfortable truths about bias and privilege. But Marcus never made him feel judged or ashamed. Instead, he guided the discussions with patience and understanding, sharing stories that highlighted the importance of empathy and communication. As their friendship grew, so did Reynolds' determination to make a difference. He started attending workshops on cultural sensitivity and reached out to local leaders in minority neighborhoods to better understand their concerns. Slowly, but surely, he became an advocate for change within his department, encouraging his colleagues to rethink how they interacted with the community. For Elijah, watching the ripple effects of that single night filled him with quiet satisfaction. One evening, as he sat on the couch flipping through channels, his dad walked in and patted him on the shoulder. "You know," Marcus said with a smile, "you played a big part in this too." Elijah looked up, confused. "Me? What did I do?" "You stood your ground," Marcus replied simply. "And because of that, someone learned a lesson they won't forget anytime soon." Elijah grinned, leaning back against the couch. For once, he didn't have to say anything. Sometimes, actions really did speak louder than words, and that night both father and son had shown exactly what they were made of. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Officer Reynolds and Marcus Johnson grew stronger than either of them had anticipated. What began as a simple conversation over coffee evolved into something much more meaningful, a partnership aimed at bridging gaps within their community. Reynolds wasn't just learning from Marcus. He was actively applying those lessons to his work, and it showed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Reynolds stood alongside Marcus at a local community event. The gathering had been organized by a coalition of neighborhood leaders, veterans, and law enforcement officers, all united by a shared goal, fostering trust between police and residents. Dozens of families milled about, children laughing as they played games while adults chatted over plates of food. Reynolds watched as Marcus spoke to a group of teenagers sitting on a picnic table. His tone was casual yet engaging, drawing them in with stories from his time in the military. "You think being in special forces means always knowing what to do?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Let me tell you, there were plenty of times I didn't have a clue. But teamwork, that's what got us through." The teens laughed, leaning forward to hear more. Elijah, who had tagged along with his dad, stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with pride. Seeing his father connect so effortlessly with others reminded him once again why he admired him so much. Meanwhile, Reynolds found himself fielding questions from parents and older residents. At first, he felt nervous, unsure if they'd see him as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. But as he listened to their concerns and shared his own efforts to improve policing practices, he noticed something remarkable happening. People were opening up to him. They weren't just criticizing. They were offering ideas, suggestions, and even praise for the changes he'd already implemented. "You're doing good work, Officer Reynolds," said one woman, a grandmother who lived 2 blocks away. "We need more cops like you, ones who listen." Her words filled him with a mix of gratitude and resolve. For years, Reynolds had thought of his job as simply enforcing laws and keeping people safe. Now he realized it was about far more than that. It was about building relationships, earning trust, and making sure everyone felt seen and heard. As the event wound down, Marcus joined Reynolds near the edge of the park. "Looks like tonight went well," Marcus remarked, nodding toward the Crowd beginning to disperse. It did, Reynolds agreed, his voice tinged with satisfaction. But none of this would have happened without your help, Mr. Johnson. You've taught me things I never learned in training. Marcus smiled, shaking, his head slightly. Don't give me too much credit, you're the one putting in the effort. All I did was point you in the right direction. Reynolds chuckled, glancing over at Elijah, who was chatting animatedly with some of the kids he'd met earlier. Well, whatever you did, it's working. And not just for me, for all of us. Back at home that night, Elijah sat cross-legged on the living room floor flipping through photos on his phone. He paused on one of his dad talking to the group of teens at the park. Dad, he said suddenly, looking up, do you think Officer Reynolds will keep doing what he's doing? Like, even after everything calms down? Marcus, seated on the couch with a book in hand, lowered it and looked at his son thoughtfully. I think so, he replied. Change isn't easy, Elijah, and it doesn't happen overnight. But when someone truly believes in something and puts in the work, it sticks. Elijah nodded slowly, processing the answer. Then, with a mischievous grin, he added, Still, though, it's pretty cool knowing we helped him figure it out. Marcus laughed, setting the book aside. Yeah, champ. It is pretty cool. As the room fell quiet, both father and son reflected on how far they'd come since that fateful night. What had started as a routine traffic stop had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted. A chance to inspire change, foster understanding, and remind everyone involved, including themselves, that respect and humility could go a long way. In the end, it wasn't just about proving a point or correcting a misunderstanding. It was about planting seeds of hope and watching them grow into something bigger than anyone expected. The partnership between Marcus Johnson and Officer Reynolds didn't stop at community events or casual conversations. It grew into something more structured, a program designed to bring police officers and local families together in meaningful ways. They called it Bridges, a name that symbolized the connections they hoped to build. The idea was simple: create opportunities for dialogue, learning, and mutual understanding. One Saturday morning, Elijah woke up early to find his dad pacing in the kitchen, a clipboard in hand. What's going on? Elijah asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Marcus glanced up, smiling. Today's the first session of Bridges. We're taking a group of officers and kids to the obstacle course at the training facility. Elijah blinked, surprised. Kids like me? Exactly like you, Marcus said, ruffling his son's hair. We want them to see what teamwork looks like, and maybe teach the officers a thing or two while we're at it. By the time they arrived at the facility, the parking lot was already buzzing with activity. A mix of teenagers, parents, and uniformed officers gathered near the entrance, chatting nervously but excitedly. Elijah spotted Officer Reynolds immediately. He was easy to pick out in his crisp uniform, standing slightly apart from the crowd as if unsure where he fit in. Officer Reynolds, Elijah called out, waving enthusiastically. The officer turned, breaking into a grin when he saw Elijah and Marcus approaching. Morning, Elijah, Reynolds said, shaking hands with both of them. Ready to put us through our paces? Elijah laughed. Oh, you have no idea. The group split into teams, pairing officers with kids and assigning each team a series of challenges. The obstacle course wasn't just about physical strength. It required communication, strategy, and trust. As the day went on, laughter echoed across the field as participants struggled and succeeded together. At one point, Elijah found himself teamed up with Officer Reynolds on a rope climbing challenge. Neither of them was particularly skilled at scaling heights, and their initial attempts ended in comical failure. But instead of frustration, they shared knowing smiles and encouraged each other to try again. You know, Reynolds said as they finally reached the top together, panting heavily, this is harder than I thought. No kidding, Elijah replied, grinning. But we made it, right? Reynolds nodded, looking down at the cheering crowd below. For a moment, he forgot about badges, uniforms, and authority. He felt like just another person working alongside others. Exactly what Marcus had hoped for when he started this initiative. As a The day came to a close. Everyone gathered under a large tent for snacks and reflection. One by one, participants stood up to share their thoughts. A teenage girl spoke about how she'd always been afraid of cops until today, when she realized they were just people trying to do their jobs. An older officer admitted he'd underestimated the value of listening to younger voices. And Elijah, stepping forward hesitantly, summed it all up perfectly. I think today showed us that no matter who you are, you can learn from someone else. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he kept it short, but powerful. This isn't the end, he said, scanning the room. It's just the beginning. If we keep showing up, for each other, for our communities, we can make real change happen. The applause that followed was heartfelt and loud, a testament to the impact of the day. As people began to leave, shaking hands and exchanging contact information, Elijah walked beside his dad, beaming with pride. You did good, Dad, he said softly. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. We all did, champ. Together. In that moment, it was clear that Bridges wasn't just a program. It was a movement. And though there was still much work to be done, the seeds of unity and respect had taken root, promising a brighter future for everyone involved. Years passed, and Elijah grew from a lanky teenager into a confident young man. The lessons he'd learned from his dad and the experiences they'd shared stayed with him, shaping the way he saw the world. He never forgot the night his father walked onto that quiet street or the journey it sparked for everyone involved. Now, standing on the stage of his high school auditorium as the graduating class president, Elijah prepared to deliver a speech that would tie together the threads of his life so far. The room was packed with proud parents, teachers, and classmates, their faces glowing under the soft lights. As Elijah adjusted the microphone, he glanced toward the front row where Marcus sat beside Officer Reynolds. The two men exchanged a small smile before turning their attention back to the stage. Good evening, Elijah began, his voice steady but warm. Tonight is about celebrating everything we've achieved, not just academically but personally. And I want to take a moment to share a story that's meant a lot to me. He paused, letting the audience settle in. Then, with a nostalgic tone, he recounted the night he'd been pulled over for riding his bike without lights. He described how Officer Reynolds had laughed at his claim about his dad being in special forces and how Marcus had shown up to prove him right. The crowd chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the tale. But this isn't just a funny story, Elijah continued, his expression growing serious. It's a reminder of something important. Respect. Respect for others, even when you don't know them. Respect for truth even when it challenges your assumptions. And respect for yourself because standing firm in who you are can inspire change. He went on to talk about the Bridges program and the impact it had made. Not just on the community, but on individuals like Officer Reynolds, who had transformed from someone skeptical into a leader committed to building trust. Change doesn't happen overnight, Elijah said, looking directly at Reynolds. But when people choose to listen, to learn and to grow, amazing things can happen. The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the auditorium with energy. As Elijah stepped off the stage, Marcus greeted him with a bear hug, pride shining in his eyes. That was incredible, son, he whispered. Later that evening, after the ceremony ended, Officer Reynolds approached Marcus and Elijah outside the school. I owe both of you a lot, he said sincerely. You didn't just teach me how to be a better officer, you taught me how to be a better person. Marcus shook his hand firmly, smiling. We all played a part, Mark. Don't forget that. As the three stood there talking, surrounded by the hum of celebration, it was clear that the bond they'd formed years ago had only grown stronger. It wasn't just about one night or one program. It was about the ripple effects of kindness, humility, and understanding. In the years to come, Elijah would go on to study journalism, determined to tell stories that brought people together. Officer Reynolds became a mentor within his department, training new recruits on cultural sensitivity and community engagement. And Marcus? He continued doing what he did best, leading quietly, teaching patiently, and reminding everyone around him that respect could bridge any divide. Their story became a legacy, a testament to the power of connection and the courage to rise above misunderstanding. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one conversation, or one act of belief to remind us that we're stronger together than we ever could be apart.